welcome back to the Blissful Badger and my March Madness Army Showcase Showdown. Throughout this month, we're going to look at all of my armies, and I'd like you to rate these armies on 5 criteria on a scale of 1 to 10. And then, at the end of the month, we're going to tally up all of the scores and see which army is the best out of my collection. So what are these criteria? 1. The paint scheme. Is my army cohesive? What level have I painted it to? Do these colors work for this army? 2. Playability. How did I go selecting models for this army? Is this a viable army on the battlefield? 3. My reason for owning it. Do I have a good justification for owning this army? 4. Theming. How much does this army fit their lore? Have I built this army to a standard that makes sense for what the army does in the lore? And 5, conversions and customization. What conversions did I make to this army? How did I make it my own? So which army are we checking out today? Today we have the Tyranids. This was my first army to ever be collected. And as you can see, it almost completely fills up my table. And yet I'm still missing quite a few of the big monsters that I could be collecting. Before making this video, I decided that I needed to have more termagants actually painted. Before now, I had a couple of each color, but I hadn't actually finished a particular unit. And the same with the Hormagaunts. So I set about painting 65 of these little guys, so that I could have nice blocks of color on the table. Especially since some of my options are no longer viable in a game. But I still love how they look on the table. I began collecting my Tyranid army towards the end of 5th edition. And I felt that bugs were definitely the right thing to collect. And I have a fair horde of them now, with about a third of them painted up. So one of the greatest things about setting up all of my Tyranids on the table at once is I get to actually look at what the army consists of, and I can actually see where my focus needs to go on what I want to purchase for the future. If you notice, I don't have very many of the newer large monsters. That includes the Exocrine and Toxicrine and Maliceptor uh, era of models, as well as the Norn emissaries and some of the more modern um, lictors and neurolictors. So setting up all of the models on the table, I can look at that and see where my holes are. And it also lets me see that even though I have a third of this army painted, it doesn't look like that because I've focused most of my time on the little bugs. I mean, having so many of my painted minis being spore mines doesn't really help overall. But even still, I painted 65 termagants recently, and yes, it looks nice when I do one little picture of this, but overall, on the whole table, it's nowhere near as nice. So my paint scheme has changed several times over the course of 6 editions. From my early days of dry brushing that didn't quite work very well, I still didn't have very much experience with this, through the period where I stippled quite a bit and did multiple coats of color for the skin tone, all the way up to the modern dry brushing and stippling combination with speed paint as my flesh tone. All of these look really great next to each other. It is an evolution, which works well with my Tyranid army. And I will continue on with this paint scheme while I'm working on all of these models. I am fairly happy with the way that I paint them now. I think I give the smaller models just a little bit too much attention, too many layers before they're done. But overall, I'm not that worried about it because I like how they turn out. And overall, with painting, that is the ultimate goal. Do you enjoy how they look? So when I'm selecting units for this army, I definitely just go with whatever I can get my hands on. In the past, it's been mostly large sets. I got 2 boxes of Leviathan. I picked up the Tyranid Christmas box back, not the most recent one, but the one before that. I have one of the Apocalypse releases. That was, I think, in 7th edition. So that's been a while. And I did get 2 copies of the old starter box with the downed ship and everything. Sadly, I only have one of those downed ships now. So some of the interesting things about my Tyranid army throughout these editions is at one point you were only allowed to take 1 flying hive tyrant, and I own 3. And I still have some custom built Tyranid hive tyrants. They have the twin devourers with brain leech worms, which no longer is a functional weapon option. I also have a Carnifex that has the same praying mantis style look to them. I like how they came out, but if you notice, I still have to get around to painting these. So overall, I think my favorite model out of all of these is my Flying Hive Tyrant that I painted up. I almost went with some of the Legends units that I just recently painted up, the Barbed Hierodule and Scythe Hierodule and the Dimachairon. But the Flying Hive Tyrant was the first large 40k model I ever purchased and painted. And so it has a little bit of a special mark to it that the other ones just do not have because they can't be my first. That part of my life, I couldn't really afford that many models, and I saved up for this particular one. And It had a lot of meaning to me, and I built it right up, and I painted it, and I gave it a lot of attention, and I did this whole model in a week. And sure, I could probably paint more of them and faster now, but I really liked how I blended the wings and how the carapace came out, and just overall, I loved that I magnetized these weapons so I can't snap them, even if I never magnetized any of the other weapon options. And overall, this is the one I like the most out of my army. It's also quite wild how many of the Tyranid models over the last 6 editions have changed their basing sizes. I'm looking at this table full of models and I'm going, wow, I have at least 100 of these that I need to actually change to the modern size. Although not quite as impressive as a full tabletop of bugs, just seeing how many models I actually have that are fully painted and based is quite a big difference. This still swarms across the board, and if you actually added all of the terrain, this is actually a fairly sizable force. With the modern point value as of this month, this is still a decent sized force, well over the 2,000 point limit that most people play at. If you would like to see a full breakdown of my army list, there is a link to a spreadsheet in the description below. Subscribe if you haven't so that you don't miss any future videos. I also want to thank my patrons and supporters for making these videos possible. And until next time, I hope you find your bit of bliss.